Do you trust politicians? In the UK today, people have never felt so suspicious towards their elected leaders. But humanity has been here many, many times before. And sometimes there is a way out. Today I want to discuss the first honest politician in history, a reforming king called Urukagina. What lessons might his remarkable story still hold for us in the 21st century? Let's now travel back 4,500 years to ancient Mesopotamia, to Sumeria in what is now southern Iraq. Instead of the Palace of Westminster behind me, imagine a jigsaw of mud brick houses filled with the clamour of construction, the chanting of priests, and the chattering of merchants. Instead of the River Thames, we have the River Tigris, its quick waters thick with bulrushes. This is the city of Lagash, and its citizens are fed up with corruption, inequality, and the way that the system is working. But everything is about to change. To understand the importance of what comes next, we must first ask, what came before? You see, in early dynastic Mesopotamia, political power was fragmented across a mosaic of city-states. But while these cities shared a common language and culture, that didn't stop them from warring with one another over the floodplain's limited resources. The city of Lagash was typical in many regards. A prosperous city of middling size, Lagash became locked in a bitter 100 years war with its neighbour Umma. The conflict was all over about who had access to valuable grazing land near the border between the two cities. The war is immortalised on the famous stele of vultures. It depicts a stern phalanx, men of Umma being netted by Lagash's fierce god Ningirsu, and vultures feasting on human carrion. Now this conflict will raise its ugly head once again later on in this story, and with decisive consequences. Kingship in this period was also none too cuddly. The title for the standard Mesopotamian king of the time was Lugal, big man, and clobbering people was an important part of the job, as the name indicates. Here, actually, the city of Lagash was something of an outlier. Their rulers took the title of Ensi, meaning governor, rather than the more militaristic Lugal. Perhaps there were a few more democratic germs on the streets of Lagash, we can only speculate. But by around 2400 BC, Lagash's politics had become sullied with corruption and oppression. Their king, a man called Lugalanda, was particularly venal and greedy. According to his successor, in Lugalanda's reign, chief boatmen appropriated boats, the chief herdsman appropriated animals, and the fishery inspector stole fishes willy-nilly. The men of the Ensi, royal thugs, were accused of cutting down the orchards of the poor and forcing them to work in the king's fields. The king's greasy fingers even began pilfering the temple coffers. Sacred oxen who were supposed to belong to the god Ningirsu were used by the king to till his own cucumber and onion patches, an absolute disgrace beyond the pale.
Oh, tastes like sin.
But luckily for Lagash, Lugalanda was replaced by someone who appears to be his polar opposite, the first reformer in history, Urukagina. Because his reign seems to signal such a sharp break, scholars often assumed that he was a usurper. Some things seem to hint in that direction. For example, nobles and royals often tended to mention who their father was on documents like Enmatena, son of Eonatum, or Gimli, son of Gloin, that sort of thing. Not Urukagina. His silence about his family connections and the fact that his brother-in-law shows up as the chief herdsman of the city suggests that perhaps Urukagina was a commoner. Yet this is not conclusive. Some scholars have argued that Urukagina did have royal blood and might have actually been Lugalanda's lawful successor. Whatever the case, his reforms are solid even by today's standards. But by the standards of the Bronze Age, they were revolutionary. We find his edicts on these clay cones which were deposited in the foundations of temples. Claiming to act on behalf of the god Ningirsu, Urukagina claims he removed all corrupt officials and abolished excessive charges for burial and divorce. He claimed he would not surrender the orphan or the widow to the whims of the powerful. He prevented the rich from forcing the poor to sell their houses to them, and he beseeched people to like, comment on this video and subscribe to the channel if they're enjoying it. But more than this, he allegedly pardoned all of the debt slaves in the city, that is, all the people who sold themselves into slavery because they couldn't afford to pay off their debts. And, most radical of all, he even claims to have released all the murderers and thieves. I know, right? Although, let's hold up, perhaps what he meant was release those who had been wrongfully accused of murder or stealing and not actually, unleashing an army of Bronze Age Jeffrey Dahmers on the world. Now I know what you're thinking, sure, he claimed these things, but isn't this just propaganda? Well, apparently not. One 2025 paper tracks the presence of so-called mashkim officials on documents from both Urukagina and his predecessor Lugalander's reign. Mashkim officials seem to have been overseers in charge of collecting fines from shepherds and fishermen who failed to provide the king with enough of their produce, perhaps because they didn't have enough for themselves. But interestingly, in the reign of Urukagina, these mashkim officials disappear from official documents altogether. In other words, it seems that these reforms weren't just boasts for the gods or propaganda for the proles, they were real. But why would Urukagina do this? Well, there are two schools of thought. First is the claim that Urukagina's reforms were really just a surreptitious way to accumulate power. Sure, on the surface these reforms seem great. For example, he gives a lot of royal land to the temple of the goddess Bao. But, you might ask, who was the head priestess of Bao? Well, it was Urukagina's wife, Sasa, or Shag Shag, as I've seen her name written. Suspiciously, Urukagina was also the first king of Lagash to actually adopt the more militaristic title of Lugal instead of Ensi, which could suggest powerful ambitions. Indeed, some have pointed out that some of Urukagina's reforms seem to be targeted at women, and specifically oppressing women. One of his edicts states, extremely ominously, that if a woman speaks disrespectfully to a man, that woman's mouth is crushed with a fired brick. The translation, however, is very uncertain. The disrespect in question could be anything from sexual solicitation to slander. But while this is a very violent and gendered law, with reference to later law codes, it doesn't seem out of step with Mesopotamian cultural norms. In other words, he was a bog-standard misogynist and not an exceptional one. Is the alternative possible, that these reforms were sincere? Well, as we've already seen, Urukagina made good on his promise to get rid of extortative and corrupt officials. Intriguingly, palace records from his reign indicate that Urukagina and his family employed far fewer servants than his predecessor, perhaps a sign of relative modesty. While his adoption of the title Lugal may sound alarming, perhaps his role became militarized because of the very real threats facing the city, which we'll come to. But if these reforms did come from a genuine wellspring of moral conviction, it doesn't mean that that conviction was Urukagina's, or at least not only his. It may be that he felt forced to carry out such reforms by a citizenry who had become formidable and steely in their opposition to corruption. But the most remarkable thing about these edicts, and what really earns them a place in the history books, is the fact it's the first time we ever see a politician seeking legitimacy for their power on the basis of serving the people. And not just the noblemen, not just the warriors, not just the priests, but the workers, the orphans, and the widows. Unfortunately, the great reformer and his amazing innovations did not last long. Lagash's perennial enemy, the city of was on the march, and energized by an ambitious new ruler called Lugalzagesi. He had already conquered the great city of Uruk, that ancient nucleus of Sumeria, before turning his sights to Lagash. The subsequent war was long and exhausting. The ruler of has set fire to the temple of Antasura. He has carried away the silver and the lapis lazuli. He has shed blood in the temple of the goddess Nanshi. He has carried away the precious metal and the precious stones. The man of by despoiling Lagash, has committed a sin against the god Ningirsu. May the hand that he dared to raise against Ningirsu be cut off. There was no fault in Urukagina, king of Lagash. May Nisaba, the goddess of Lugalzagesi, ruler of make him bear his mortal sin upon his neck. Urukagina does seem to have limped on, for a little while at least, as the ruler of the neighbouring town of Girsu. Ultimately, Urukagina vanishes from the historical record after a reign of about 10 years. We don't know his ultimate fate. But victory, no matter how sweet it tasted, would soon turn to ash in mouth. Lugalzagesi was soon crushed and dragged in chains before the gods by another conqueror of much greater renown, Sargon of Akkad. An age of empires had begun, one in which the reforming king of a single city might have faded into irrelevance. Yet, Urukagina has survived. It is he and not his foes who leaves a sweet scent in the air and, in the long run, made a bigger impact. In the world-famous law codes of Hammurabi, written some 600 years later in Babylon, the king states, "The great gods have called me. I am the salvation-bearing shepherd whose staff is straight, the good shadow that is spread over my city. On my breast I cherish the inhabitants of the land of Sumer and Akkad. In my shelter I have let them repose in peace. In my deep wisdom have I enclosed them, that the strong might not injure the weak, in order to protect the widows and orphans." But have we lost touch with these principles? Do we too need an Urukagina or a movement which can birth one? I take heart in the fact that the story of the world's first honest politician proves that we can have honest politicians. That's not a contradiction in terms. The future is always there for the taking, no matter how bleak things look. Sure, we might be fighting many of the same battles as we were 4,500 years ago. The poor, the widows, and the orphans, they still get a rough deal. But if in this globalized age we can unite with strength and compassion, then we can do far more good than an ancient Sumerian king in a city on the banks of the river Tigris 4,500 years ago could even have dreamt of. Thanks for watching. I hope you like and comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and stick around for the next one.